Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome to our little corner of warmth and mystery. Tonight, in the snow-dusted village of St. Mary Mead, we settle into our armchairs with a steaming cup of tea and a flickering fire, ready for a tale of secrets and clever observation. In this story, The Cat Who Knew Murder, a Miss Marple Mystery, a curious ginger cat seems to know more than anyone suspects, pacing silently near hidden clues and watching the villagers' every move. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you joining from tonight? So let's start our today mystery. Chapter 1, Whispers Over Seed Cake. The morning sun had barely crested over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead when the village began to stir, though today the usual calm seemed strained, as though the air itself held its breath. Doors opened with a little more hesitation than usual, and voices, normally cheerful over breakfast tea, carried a sharp edge of uncertainty. Word of Mr. Pritchard's sudden collapse at the Christmas fete had spread like a chill through the village, and now every doorway and window seemed to host a whisper. Every teacup trembled with conjecture. In the vicarage kitchen, Mrs. Dolly Bantry poured a fresh pot of tea, the delicate aroma mingling with the faint scent of burnt pastry still lingering from yesterday's event. She set down the tray with a small sigh, aware that every visitor who arrived would bring their own theory, and each one would likely contradict the last. "I say," began Mrs. Peters, the baker's wife, lowering her voice as if the teacups themselves might gossip, "it must have been a sherry. You can't trust a man's constitution after a pint. Not in his 80s. "Oh, nonsense," countered Mrs. Price, the dressmaker, fingering her lace gloves nervously. "He was a sturdy man, always sprightly. I saw him only last week at the village hall. No, I dare say there's something more deliberate here. Perhaps a trick of the mind, or a shadow from his past." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, cradled her own teacup with gentle fingers. She did not interrupt, nor did she offer her opinion outright. Instead, she allowed the murmur of voices to swirl around her like the steam rising from her tea. There was an almost musical rhythm to the gossip, punctuated by hesitant glances toward her. She listened to the villagers' half-formed theories, noting the contradictions, the inconsistencies, and, most importantly, the things left unsaid. A pause here, a fleeting glance there. These were the crumbs that often led her to the truth. Across the table, Mrs. Peters whispered again, this time leaning closer. "But you must admit, Dolly, it's curious. So sudden. One moment he's laughing with the children, handing out pennies for the raffle, and the next, her hand fluttered in the air, unfinished." "Yes, indeed," murmured Mrs. Price, her voice barely audible. "And did you see the look in Miss Ellery's eyes? So troubled. One wonders whether the shadows of secrets were weighing on more than just Mr. Pritchard." Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a subtle tightening around Mrs. Ellery's mouth and the slight tremor of her fingers as she set down her cup. That alone might seem trivial to anyone else, but in her experience, such small gestures were the threads from which the whole pattern of human behavior could be woven. There was unease in the air, yes, but it was not fear alone. It was fear mixed with calculation, curiosity, and, perhaps, a touch of guilt. Outside, the church bells began their morning toll, their steady chime contrasting with the nervous chatter within the vicarage. Villagers paused in their steps, as though the solemn pealing reminded them of the fragile boundary between life and its sudden, inexplicable end. In that moment, Miss Marple lifted her gaze to the window, noting the figures hurrying along the snowy lane, the small dog that barked too sharply at the wind, and the glint of sunlight on the icy rooftops. Each detail, she knew, was part of the larger picture. And as the whispers of St. Mary Mead continued to circle like leaves caught in a gust, Miss Marple quietly sipped her tea, inwardly cataloging each word, each glance, each pause, readying herself to unravel the mystery that had so unexpectedly settled upon her beloved village. The vicarage parlor was a scene of gentle domesticity, yet beneath the lace curtains and the polished brass ornaments, a quiet tension lingered. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting forgotten in her lap, as the village visitors filtered in, drawn by curiosity and concern. Tea steamed in delicate cups, mince pies tempted even the most anxious, and the clock ticked on as if trying to maintain a sense of normality. But it was not the humans who captured her attention so much as the small, ginger cat perched on the hearthrug, its amber eyes gleaming with an intelligence that seemed almost unervingly sharp. The creature had been at the fete the previous evening, slipping through the crowd with effortless ease, brushing past Mr. Pritchard's elbow just before he had collapsed. Miss Marple recalled that moment vividly. The old man's startled glance, the brief flutter of the cat's tail, and then the sudden heaviness that had caused him to slump to the floor. Now, in the soft morning light, the cat's attention appeared focused on the guests in a peculiar way, darting glances between hands, laps, and the small pile of belongings Mr. Pritchard had brought home with him. "Isn't he a curious creature?" whispered Mrs. Peters, noticing Miss Marple's gaze. "He seems to know more than any of us." "Yes," replied Miss Marple softly, a faint smile touching her lips. "And sometimes one finds that animals can see the things people overlook." The ginger cat twitched its ears, rising to stretch, its back arching in a graceful curve, and then settling again as if to claim the very center of attention. Miss Marple's eyes followed the subtle movements, noting how the cat lingered near Mr. Pritchard's coat draped over the chair, pausing at the place where his walking stick had been left leaning against the table. There is a certain insistence in the animal's focus, an almost deliberate insistence that something was amiss. Visitors murmured softly to one another, exchanging theories of accident, misstep, or sudden illness, yet the cat seemed uninterested in the chatter. It moved with silent precision, sniffing lightly at the carpet, occasionally brushing a paw against the hem of the coat, and returning its gaze to Miss Marple as if inviting her to notice what it already knew. She allowed herself a small, knowing nod. Animals, after all, often observed with clarity that human curiosity could scarcely match. The vicar poured more tea, the silver tray catching the sunlight in tiny, dancing flashes. A few children peeked from behind the doorframe, their eyes wide with both excitement and unease. Yet the cat remained unbothered by the commotion, its attention entirely fixed upon the remnants of Mr. Pritchard's belongings. Miss Marple's mind turned over possibilities. Could a clue have fallen unnoticed among the scarves and hats? Or perhaps something even smaller, something easily dismissed, was hidden in plain sight? And then, as if responding to an unspoken signal, the cat rolled onto its side, exposing a glimmer of something caught in its fur. Miss Marple leaned forward, curiosity piqued, the subtle thrill of discovery brushing at her fingertips. Carefully, she reached toward the tiny, shiny object, mindful of the cat's claws and the potential significance of whatever it concealed. What was it that the creature had so insistently guarded? Was it a trinket, an ornament, or something far more telling about the events of the fete? As her fingers brushed the ginger fur, the shimmer of metal reflected the morning light, and Miss Marple's mind began to race, connecting threads invisible to anyone else. The parlor seemed to hold its breath, and even the ticking clock slowed in her perception, while she bent closer to examine the treasure the cat had chosen to reveal. Chapter 2. The Letter in the Ashes. The small hearth of Mr. Pritchard's cottage still bore the faint scent of charred paper, mingling with the lingering aroma of strong black tea that had been left cooling on the sideboard. Miss Marple knelt carefully by the hearth, her fingers brushing away the remnants of ashes with delicate precision, revealing the fragile edges of what remained of a letter. The paper was scorched and curled, but a few words, fragmentary and tantalizing, still peeked through, must be revealed before, and a hurried signature that had long since turned to a smudge. Even in its ruined state, the letter suggested secrets, whispers of a hidden past, and perhaps a warning unheeded. "Dear me," muttered the constable, adjusting his spectacles as he peered over her shoulder. "I suppose this is some sort of final note? He might have been ill, you know. Perhaps he—" Miss Marple raised a finger, politely halting his speculation. "Do not be so quick to leap to conclusions, Mr. Carter," she said softly, her voice calm yet firm. "The ashes tell only part of the tale. What is left can sometimes reveal more than what is intact." The vicar stood nearby, his brow furrowed, wringing his hands in the manner of those who feel a great responsibility but cannot name it. "I've never seen Mr. Pritchard so secretive," he murmured. "He was always cheerful, fond of his village gossip, never a man to brood over hidden matters. And yet, his voice trailed in his silence, the unfinished thought heavy in the room." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the scattered fragments, noting the handwriting's unusual slant, the uneven pressure on the paper, and the small, dark stain in one corner that might have been ink or something else. Each detail, she knew, was a thread to follow. The letter had not been casually burned. The edges were carefully charred, suggesting deliberate concealment. Someone had wanted its contents destroyed, yet fate, or misjudgment, had allowed pieces to survive. Outside, a light snow began to drift against the windows, feathering the world with quiet white, the perfect contrast to the tension within the cottage walls. A few villagers lingered by the gate, peering through the frost-laced glass, drawn by curiosity and dread in equal measure. Gossip, after all, travels faster than footsteps, and each whisper that reached the vicarage hinted at something darker beneath the ordinary village life. Martha, the maid, hovered at the doorway, wringing her hands nervously. Her eyes darted between Miss Marple and the charred letter. I shouldn't say," she began, voice trembling, "but I did hear Mr. Pritchard speaking to someone last week. He seemed anxious, almost frightened. I don't know who it was. He met them near the lighthouse." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the window, imagining the cold, desolate cliffs and the lighthouse standing sentinel against the waves. A chill ran through her, not from the snow, but from the implications of Martha's confession. Lighthouse, anxious meeting, secretive letters. It all hinted that Mr. Pritchard's cheerful exterior had concealed something much more complicated. "Thank you, Martha," Miss Marple said gently, placing a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "You've given me something to ponder." She bent again over the remnants of the letter, carefully teasing apart the curled fragments with the tip of her finger. Every scrap was precious. Every word, though incomplete, was a window into the puzzle she intended to solve. And as she gathered the pieces, her mind began to assemble the invisible map of motives, whispers, and concealed truths. In the midst of soot and paper, she sensed the faint outlines of a mystery that was far from simple, one that required patience, observation, and perhaps the insight of a quiet village cat who watched more than any human realized. The cottage kitchen was small, warm from the morning fire, yet filled with an uneasy stillness. Miss Marple sat at the wooden table, her knitting resting beside her teacup, as Martha hovered nervously near the doorway, hands clasped tightly. The young maid's eyes were wide, darting between the detective's calm gaze and the hearth where the ashes of Mr. Pritchard's burned letter still lingered. It was clear she carried something heavy within her, a secret that refused to be spoken aloud, yet pressed insistently upon her conscience. I shouldn't speak out of turn, Miss Marple," Martha began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I heard something last week. Mr. Pritchard," he argued with a visitor one I did not recognize. It was late in the evening by the lamplight. I did not catch his words clearly, only the tone, sharp, worried, almost frightened. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup. She had learned long ago that such fleeting admissions often held more significance than long-winded confessions. "You saw him near the fireplace, Martha?" she asked gently. "And the visitor? Any detail at all? Voice, manner, clothing?" The maid hesitated, biting her lip. "I only glimpsed the edge of coat, dark, heavy wool. The voice was muffled by the wind. I think it was male. That is all I know, I swear. I did not wish to intrude." "No one is intruding, my dear," Miss Marple reassured her, offering a faint smile. "You are helping, and sometimes the smallest fragment of a moment, just the edge of coat, the tone of voice, can reveal more than an entire day's gossip." Martha shifted, glancing toward the window where the snow had begun to dust the garden in gentle white. It was not just the visitor," she murmured, voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Pritchard seemed uneasy about someone else, too. I think he feared that something he knew, or had done, might be discovered." Miss Marple's mind began to turn over the possibilities, linking the charred remnants of the letter with the anxious glance of Martha's eyes. So Mr. Pritchard's fear was not without cause. There was something hidden somewhere in the quiet corners of the village that had weighed upon him, perhaps for years. And now, with his sudden collapse, the puzzle had only deepened. "You've done very well, Martha," Miss Marple said kindly, placing a hand over the maid's. "Do you know why Mr. Pritchard's letter was burned?" Martha shook her head, swallowing hard. "I do not, ma'am, but I think someone wanted to make sure no one knew what was in it." The words hung in the air like the fine dust of ashes. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fireplace, tracing the charred edges of the letter once more. It was deliberate, she realized, far from accidental. Someone had gone to considerable effort to destroy evidence. Yet in doing so, they had left enough behind for a keen eye to notice. A faint rustle at the window drew Miss Marple's attention. Outside, the ginger cat, the same creature that had been so observant at the fete, prowled along the snowy garden path, pausing to glance through the glass. Its amber eyes seemed almost knowingly directed at her, as though affirming the truths Martha had just revealed. Even the simplest of animals, she reflected, could perceive tensions and secrets that humans overlooked. "Thank you, Martha," Miss Marple said once more, her voice warm but firm. "You have given me the first threads of a very tangled story. I shall have to follow them carefully." Martha exhaled, relief mingled with lingering fear, and stepped back toward the doorway. Miss Marple remained by the fire, her gaze lingering on the ashes, the small fragments of the letter, and the ginger cat's inscrutable stare. Somewhere amid these quiet clues lay the beginning of an answer, the first step toward understanding the mystery that had so abruptly entered their village lives. Chapter 3: The Widow's Veil. The morning fog hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the hedgerows and muffling the clip-clop of boots on the cobblestone streets. The village seemed reluctant to awaken fully, as if still mourning the sudden death of Mr. Pritchard. By the vicarage, however, the usual rhythm of tea and gossip had resumed, though now it carried an undertone of suspicion sharper than any winter wind. Miss Marple observed from her chair near the fire, her knitting resting idly in her lap. She was not blind to the whispers that threaded through the room, the carefully measured glances, and the pointed comments that seemed innocent enough to outsiders but were loaded with implication. Today, it seemed, the focus of curiosity and concern had shifted. All eyes, and quite a few tongues, were upon Mrs. Ellery. "Did you see her at the fete?" Mrs. Peters asked, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "She was near Mr. Pritchard just before he collapsed. Quite close, I should say. And she seemed so nervous." Mrs. Price, who sat primly with her hands folded over a neatly pressed lap, nodded. "Yes. And the rumors, debts, mismanagement, the inability to keep her late husband's affairs in order. It's all rather convenient timing, isn't it?" Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, allowing the conversation to drift over her. She noticed the subtle sharpening of the other villagers' expressions, the way their eyes lingered a little too long on Mrs. Ellery's face, searching for hints of guilt. There was an intensity in their scrutiny that suggested the fear of scandal was mingling with the thrill of accusation. The room was warm, redolent with the scent of baking and the faint tinge of perfume. Yet beneath it all lay a tension that was almost tangible. Even the vicar, ordinarily so composed, shifted nervously in his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his coat as though to ensure propriety could somehow shield him from the weight of collective suspicion. Mrs. Ellery herself remained composed, though there was a trace of weariness in her eyes. She poured herself some tea with deliberate care, the motion precise but slow, as if each gesture was being noted and analyzed by every corner of the room. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted the cup, and the almost imperceptible flinch when a neighbor mentioned the raffle table. Innocent, perhaps, but telling nonetheless. "Really," Mrs. Peters whispered, leaning closer to Miss Marple as if sharing a confidential thought, "one wonders why she was so anxious. No one could blame her if she were concerned for the poor gentleman's well-being. But there's something more." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Gossip," she mused, "often carries a kernel of truth, but rarely in the form it appears. People speak in fragments, gestures, and innuendos." It was her task to sift through the chatter, to separate the inconsequential from the vital. Outside, the church bells tolled once, slow and solemn, drawing a hush over the street. Passers-by paused mid-step, their shadows stretching long across the frost-specked road. In that quiet, Miss Marple felt the weight of the village's collective attention, all pointed toward Mrs. Ellery. And yet, beneath the fear and scrutiny, she detected a flicker of innocence, or at least a carefully hidden truth. The chatter continued, punctuated by small gasps and exchanged glances. And through it all, Miss Marple, with the patience of a cat observing the room, quietly catalogued every movement, every hesitation, every syllable. For she knew, as always, that the truth was never as simple as the gossip made it appear, and the answers often lay in the subtle, almost invisible details. Mrs. Ellery sat stiffly in the vicarage parlor, the morning sunlight spilling across her black dress and casting pale reflections on the polished floorboards. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening, and her eyes, though weary, held a quiet dignity. Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite her, observing closely the subtle movements, the way Mrs. Ellery's fingers twitched when she spoke, the faint tremor in her voice, the controlled yet perceptible rise and fall of her chest as she drew each breath. Every detail mattered. "Mrs. Ellery," Miss Marple began gently, "I can imagine this is a difficult time for you. There is much talk in the village, but I need only the truth. Would you tell me what happened to the fate?" Mrs. Ellery's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I was only concerned for Mr. Pritchard, Miss Marple. He seemed cheerful enough, handing out his pennies and chatting with the children. But suddenly, he fell. I was near, yes, but I did not touch him, I swear it. I could not have done anything to harm him. The room was silent, except for the quiet ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, a breeze rustled the bare branches of the old yew tree in the vicarage garden, and the shadows of passers-by moved across the window panes. Miss Marple's gaze, unwavering, took in a tremor in Mrs. Ellery's hands as she clasped her teacup. There was fear there, certainly, but was it fear of accusation, or fear of some truth unspoken? "Your distress is understandable," Miss Marple said softly, "but the village whispers suggest motives where none may exist. People are quick to judge what they do not understand. Yet I must ask, did you notice anything unusual, anything that seemed out of place that evening?" Mrs. Ellery shook her head, but the movement was hesitant. "There was a moment," she murmured, "when I thought I saw a figure lingering near Mr. Pritchard. It was fleeting, and I did not dare follow, for I thought it none of my concern. I only know that after his fall, there were glances, hurried whispers, and I fear that I have been blamed for what I did not do." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the fragments. Blame often fell upon the most vulnerable or visible, and widows, unfortunately, were prime candidates for suspicion. Yet the clues lay not in conjecture alone, but in the subtle interplay of gestures, glances, and reactions. "I believe you, Mrs. Ellery," Miss Marple said with quiet assurance. "You were present, yes, but presence does not equate to culpability. There is something else at work here, some hidden motive, perhaps, or secret long buried, that has now come to light." Mrs. Ellery's lips trembled. "Do you think that someone planted the evidence? The torn black veil that was found by the door? It was mine, but I did not leave it there. I did not." Her voice broke, trailing into a whisper. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes softening. "It is quite possible. The smallest objects can be used to mislead, to draw suspicion away from the truth. And sometimes the simplest gestures, a discarded veil, a glance, a hesitation, can tell us more than words ever could." Outside, a faint mewing drew their attention to the window, where the ginger cat lingered once again, tail flicking, eyes fixed on some imperceptible point within the parlor. Miss Marple glanced at it briefly, noting that the creature had been present for every small revelation, every hint of unease, as though silently affirming or guiding her perception. "Rest assured, Mrs. Ellery," Miss Marple said gently, rising from her chair, "the truth has a way of revealing itself in time, and I intend to find it." Mrs. Ellery exhaled shakily, a mixture of relief and lingering fear, and pressed her hands to her lap. Miss Marple's mind, already active, turned over the fragments of what Martha had told her, the letter in the ashes, and the subtle signals that even the cat seemed to understand. Somewhere in these quiet clues lay the answer, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 4. Lanterns in the Fog. The wind off the coast was brisk, carrying with it the sharp tang of salt and the faint whistle of waves against the rocks. Miss Marple had walked the narrow lane that led from St. Mary Mead to the old lighthouse, a solitary sentinel perched atop the cliffs. The structure, whitewashed and time-worn, had stood for decades, guiding ships safely through fog and storm. Yet beneath its steadfast exterior lay memories long hidden, whispers of incidents that few in the village spoke of openly. Miss Marple paused at the rusted gate, noting the peeling paint and the wild grasses that crept along the path. It was said that Mr. Pritchard, during his tenure as lighthouse keeper, had witnessed many a secret, smugglers in the fog, clandestine exchanges in the dead of night, and the occasional dispute that had never reached the court or the newspapers. At the time, it had seemed a distant world, a series of isolated events, yet now, in light of his sudden collapse, those shadows took on new significance. She recalled how, as a young woman, she had known some of the families who lived along this stretch of coast. They had spoken, in hushed tones, of strange lights bobbing on the waves, of crates moved under cover of darkness, and of a small circle of men and women who trusted few but were deeply entwined in village affairs. Could it be that Mr. Pritchard's fear, whispered to Martha and hinted at in his burned letter, was connected to these old secrets? A faint crunch of gravel drew her attention. A caretaker, an elderly man with eyes as sharp as seagulls and a careful gait, emerged from the lighthouse doorway. He tipped his cap politely. "Miss Marple," he said, voice carrying the rough timbre of sea winds. "I imagine you're not here merely for the view. Folks say you have a knack for noticing things others miss." Miss Marple inclined her head gracefully. "Indeed, I find that places, like people, often retain traces of the past. I am here to understand Mr. Pritchard's unease, what he may have known, and why it might matter now." The caretaker nodded, glancing toward the cliffs where the ocean spread wide and unyielding. "Many things are better left unspoken," he murmured. "But there are records, logs, and entries, small notes kept in the lighthouse ledger. Pritchard was meticulous about them, though he never shared all with anyone." Inside the lighthouse, Miss Marple traced the spiral staircase, noting the narrow steps worn smooth by decades of use. She paused before a small cabinet containing the old logbooks, each page filled with neat, deliberate entries. Dates, times, vessels, and cryptic notations of goods and visitors. The record of a life steeped in observation and careful documentation. Her eyes lingered on one entry, a mention of a late-night meeting, a visitor from the mainland, and a reference to a shipment misplaced but accounted for. She considered the possibilities. Perhaps this was the something that had weighed on Mr. Pritchard's conscience, a long-buried event now threatening to surface in the village gossip and fears. Miss Marple closed the book gently, her mind weaving threads between the present and the past. The lighthouse, with its steadfast light cutting through fog and darkness, had witnessed more than it seemed. And now, it seemed that the shadows of its history might explain the unease that had plagued Mr. Pritchard, and perhaps even the tragic events at the Christmas fete. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and a single gull wheeled over the cliffs. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the horizon, already considering which threads of history she must follow next. The past, she knew, rarely stays buried forever, and sometimes it waits patiently for the right observer to uncover its secrets. Back in the vicarage parlor, the soft firelight cast flickering shadows across the walls, lending a gentle warmth to the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall in delicate, swirling flakes, dusting the windowsills and garden paths with a quiet hush. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair, eyes fixed on the ginger cat that prowled with unusual purpose across the room. It had arrived with her that morning, slipping through the doorway as though it, too, sensed the urgency of discovery. The creature's attention was fixed on a small pile of objects that had belonged to Mr. Pritchard, his walking stick, a folded coat, and a few scattered papers, remnants of a life orderly, yet suddenly disrupted. The cat sniffed, pawed gently at the fabrics, and then paused, its amber eyes gleaming in a way that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. Miss Marple's fingers twitched in response. The animal seemed determined to guide her, to point out what human eyes might have overlooked. Carefully, she followed the cat's movements, noting how it traced a path toward one particular item, a small, ribboned raffle ornament that had been among the gifts at the fete. The ribbon had frayed edges, caught delicately on the hearthrug. The cat pawed at it, then flicked its tail toward the edge of the chair, where another fragment of ribbon peeked from beneath the coat. Miss Marple leaned forward, her mind quietly racing. Something in these trimmings, so easily dismissed as mere decoration, had drawn the animal's attention with uncanny precision. The room remained hushed, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Visitors lingered nearby, sipping tea and exchanging muted comments, unaware that the smallest movements of this ordinary cat might reveal clues that would otherwise remain hidden. Miss Marple reflected that intuition, whether human or feline, often recognized patterns invisible to others, and it was her task to translate that instinct into understanding. The ginger cat paused, turned its head, and stared directly at Miss Marple. Its gaze was steady, almost expectant, as though inviting her to notice what lay beneath the simple pile of belongings. She leaned closer, careful not to startle it, and gently brushed aside the hem of the coat. There, tangled within the soft fur of the cat, glimmered something metallic, a small, reflective object, hardly larger than a coin, that caught the firelight in a tiny, compelling flash. Miss Marple's fingers closed around it with delicate care. The object was heavier than it appeared, smooth and cold, and though she could not yet discern its purpose, she recognized its importance instantly. The cat, as if satisfied with the result of its insistence, leapt gracefully onto the windowsill, curling its tail and regarding her with quiet triumph. The detective examined the find more closely. It might have been overlooked by anyone else, tucked away, disguised within the ordinary. Yet here it was, revealed through a combination of instinct, observation, and patience. Miss Marple's mind began to trace the possibilities. How this small object could link to Mr. Pritchard's sudden collapse, the charred fragments of the letter, and the secrets that lingered in the village's quiet corners. She placed the item carefully on the table, pausing to watch the cat slink away toward the garden. The animal's purposeful presence, she realized, was more than coincidence. It had drawn her to a clue that would help untangle the threads of a mystery far deeper than any of the villagers suspected. Outside, the wind stirred the snow, whispering faintly against the windows, as if hinting that the past and present were now converging in the warmth of the vicarage parlor. Chapter 5. The Broken Teacup. Dr. Latham's surgery smelled faintly of antiseptic and old leather, a scent that always reminded Miss Marple of quiet afternoons spent in conversation with patients rather than in the stir of urgent emergencies. Today, however, the air was tense, filled with the low murmur of concerned villagers and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards under heavy boots. Mr. Pritchard's sudden collapse had drawn attention far beyond the fate, and whispers of misdiagnosis and oversight clung stubbornly to the edges of conversation. Dr. Latham, a man of precise habits and a meticulous nature, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "I assure you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice carefully measured, "I did everything within my knowledge to attend to Mr. Pritchard. He seemed in good health that day." Yet his eyes flickered toward the window, where the frost-laced garden suggested stillness, but concealed many unnoticed movements. There may have been an element I overlooked, something subtle, almost imperceptible, that could have contributed to his collapse. Miss Marple inclined her head, her fingers lightly resting on her knitting, observing the doctor's demeanor. She knew him well enough to recognize that the smallest hesitation in a man of his profession often carried weightier significance than any outright statement. "Subtle, you say?" she murmured. Perhaps the matter was not one of negligence, but rather of something overlooked, something hidden within the ordinary routine. Dr. Latham adjusted a folder on his desk and nodded. "Precisely. There were symptoms, minor and easily dismissed. A paleness in the hands, a subtle tremor, a fleeting glance of anxiety in his eyes. One could attribute them to age or fatigue. Yet now, in retrospect, these indicators might point to something more deliberate. I am bound by my oath to treat, not to speculate, but one cannot ignore such details entirely." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint crease in the doctor's forehead, the slight tightening around his mouth. He was clearly grappling with the tension between professional integrity and the unsettling suspicion that he might have missed a clue others would deem crucial. She considered how such small errors, unintentional though they might be, could have been exploited or misunderstood by those with less noble intentions. Outside, the snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing the village in a soft white hush. It was a season for reflection, for careful observation, and for noticing that which others might pass by. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, imagining the shadows moving silently across the street, the villagers whispering in hushed tones, and the ginger cat prowling somewhere nearby, ever vigilant. There is a rhythm to human behavior, she thought, and even mistakes followed it, revealing patterns if one only cared to look closely. Dr. Latham continued, his tone slightly more hurried. "I recall, now, a minor incident, one which seemed trivial at the time. Mr. Pritchard had misplaced a small item, perhaps a key or a trinket, and he appeared unusually concerned. I dismissed it lightly, advising him to search calmly. But the worry in his eyes, I see now that it may have meant far more than I realized." Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting threads. The charred fragments of the letter, Martha's confession, the cat's persistent observation, and now this subtle detail of a missing item. Each clue pointed toward a puzzle hidden in plain sight, a mystery wrapped in ordinary gestures, overlooked by all but the most attentive observer. She rose from her chair, her calm demeanor betraying none of the quiet excitement in her mind. "Thank you, Dr. Latham," she said gently. "Your recollection has given me more than you realize. Often, what is deemed an error is merely the first step toward understanding a far greater truth." The vicarage parlor was warm and inviting, the scent of fresh scones and brewing tea mingling with the faint smoke from the fire. Miss Marple sat comfortably in her favorite chair, the ginger cat curled at her feet, as the village ladies gathered around, voices low and conspiratorial. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, yet beneath the polished surfaces and laced doilies lay a current of unease, a subtle tension that threaded through every carefully measured gesture. Miss Marple lifted her delicate teacup, the rim just brushing her lips, when suddenly the cup slipped. For a moment, it seemed to hang in midair, the steam curling upward in slow, graceful arcs, before it toppled to the floor with a sharp, crystalline crash. The sound drew gasps from the visitors, and a faint tremor passed through the cat, whose tail flicked nervously. Miss Marple bent forward, unperturbed by the mishap, to survey the fragments scattered across the hearthrug. As she gathered the pieces, her eyes caught the glint of something familiar. One small shard reflected the firelight in a way that reminded her unmistakably of the shiny object she had found tangled in the ginger cat's fur days earlier, a fragment of a tiny, broken vial. Her fingers traced the delicate edges, careful not to cut herself, and her mind began to assemble the implications. The discovery was both mundane and extraordinary. A small, fragile vessel, once unremarkable, now spoke volumes about the events that had unfolded. The village ladies murmured among themselves, glancing nervously at the shards, unaware of their full significance. "Oh dear," Mrs. Peters said softly, "what a dreadful accident." Miss Marple allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "Not an accident, my dear," she replied quietly, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "Merely a reminder that the smallest objects can hold secrets if one knows how to look for them." Her gaze swept across the room, noting every reaction, every subtle gesture. Mrs. Ellery's fingers tightened around her teacup. Mrs. Price's posture stiffened, and even the vicar seemed momentarily distracted, glancing toward the fireplace, as if sensing the import of Miss Marple's sudden realization. The broken cup, so ordinary in appearance, had suddenly illuminated a connection that had eluded the village's eyes until now. Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly, tracing the path of the mysterious object, first found in the cat's fur, now mirrored in the fragments at her feet. She considered the possibilities, turning over each scenario with careful deliberation. If the shiny object was indeed part of a vial, and if its contents had been intended for someone's tea, then the method of delivery was far more ingenious and insidious than anyone had imagined. The simplicity of the vial's concealment, the deceptive normality of a teacup, and the trust inherent in the ritual of afternoon tea all pointed toward a clever, deliberate act. Her fingers lingered on a particularly small shard, its curve catching the light just so, and she realized, with a quiet thrill, the extraordinary subtlety of the design. The poison had not been administered in an obvious manner. It had been hidden within an everyday object, a commonplace vessel, the kind that no one would question, the kind that would pass unnoticed until the moment of effect. Miss Marple's eyes lifted to the assembled company, her expression calm, yet charged with quiet certainty. She did not speak immediately, allowing the tension to settle, giving them all a sense of the invisible threads she was unraveling. The realization, though silent for now, was profound. The danger had been present in plain sight, hidden behind the comforting ritual of tea, and it was the smallest details that would reveal the truth. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches, carrying with it the faint hint of snowflakes against the windowpane. The room remained hushed, and Miss Marple's mind raced with the implications. Somewhere within this parlor, amid the warmth and polite conversation, lay the method, the means, and the motive that had brought Mr. Pritchard to his untimely fate. And now, she knew precisely where to look. Chapter 6. A Net of Deceit. The drawing-room of the vicarage glowed softly in the evening light, candles flickering in their brass holders, casting gentle shadows on the polished floorboards. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying a faint chill that made the hearth's warmth all the more inviting. Miss Marple moved quietly among her preparations, arranging the seating with the precision of a woman accustomed to observing the subtleties of human behavior. Tonight, the gathering was no ordinary tea. It was a carefully orchestrated assembly, a net designed to draw out truths hidden beneath polite smiles and courteous nods. Invitations had been extended under the guise of a social call. Mrs. Ellery, Mrs. Peters, the vicar, Dr. Latham, and a handful of other villagers, all of whom had connections to Mr. Pritchard and, by extension, to the secrets that now lay scattered like confetti in the wake of his sudden demise. Each guest arrived with a mixture of curiosity and unease, unsure whether the evening promised mere comfort or subtle confrontation. Miss Marple's calm demeanor, however, reassured them just enough to mask the intricate plan she had set in motion. Tea was served in delicate porcelain cups, the clink of teaspoons and the rustle of fine fabrics punctuating the gentle murmur of conversation. Miss Marple moved through the room with quiet grace, offering light comments on the weather, the recent snow, and the virtues of properly baked scones. Yet beneath this genial surface, her mind worked with meticulous care, noting the posture of each guest, the slight hesitation in their responses, and the flicker of attention whenever she mentioned Mr. Pritchard's affairs. As the evening progressed, she began to drop subtle hints, each one carefully designed to provoke thought without alarm. "It is curious," she observed, stirring her own cup absent-mindedly, "how letters sometimes vanish or debts remain unspoken. Small things can cause great unease, even among the closest of neighbors." Her words were casual, yet their implication was clear to those who had ears to hear. A murmur ran through the company, and eyes flickered nervously toward one another. Mrs. Peters shifted in her seat, her hands tightening around her teacup. "Letters, you say?" she asked cautiously. "What sort of letters?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, inclining her head. "Oh, the kind that hint at past misunderstandings, perhaps secrets that some would prefer remain hidden. And debts, too, financial or otherwise, can weigh heavily on conscience. Sometimes the smallest omission can have the most dramatic consequences." Dr. Latham cleared his throat, eyes flicking to the floor briefly before meeting hers. "Certainly, one must be careful with such matters. Misplaced words, forgotten promises, they can be dangerous, yes, even fatal in their effect." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging the truth in his statement, while keeping her own thoughts guarded. She had arranged the seating deliberately, ensuring that each suspect would be placed where their reactions could be observed without overt interference. Mrs. Ellery, seated near the fireplace, kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression composed yet tense. The vicar leaned slightly forward, attentive, as if hoping to catch a clue before it spoke aloud. The subtle tension in the room was palpable, a delicate web of curiosity and fear that Miss Marple had spun with gentle precision. Each remark, each gesture was noted, catalogued, and analyzed in the quiet of her mind. The trap was not one of confrontation, but of exposure, a net of social observation that would allow the guilty, or the wary, self-reveal through their own impulses and reactions. And as the evening deepened, the candles flickered and shadows lengthened. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the assembled company. Every detail, every glance, every faint tremor of the hand or quiver of the lip was a thread in the web she had spun, threads that, when followed carefully, would lead inexorably to the truth. Tonight, the final trap was set, and the subtle dance of revelation was about to begin. The vicarage drawing-room was alive with the subdued murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of porcelain cups and the gentle hiss of the fire. Shadows danced across the polished floorboards, and the faint scent of tea and scones mingled with the crisp winter air that had seeped in through slightly ajar windows. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting forgotten in her lap, her eyes following the ginger cat as it prowled the room with a deliberate purpose. The creature had been unusually attentive all evening, moving from guest to guest with a precision that suggested far more than casual curiosity. Suddenly, with a fluid leap, the cat landed gracefully on the lap of one of the more nervous guests, Mr. Holloway, a man known for his frequent trips to the mainland and an uneasy smile that rarely reached his eyes. The room fell silent in surprise, all attention drawn to the small figure now pawing insistently at the inside pocket of his coat. The man froze, a hand twitching toward the pocket as if to intercept the feline's determined efforts. But the cat was quicker, scraping gently until a small, charred fragment slipped free and landed on the floor with a soft tap. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. The shard gleamed faintly in the firelight, a fragment unmistakably matching the pieces she had found burned in the hearth at Mr. Pritchard's home. The missing half of the letter had been concealed in the most ordinary of places, a pocket that would likely have escaped notice for months, perhaps years. The room was hushed, the guests holding their collective breath as the significance of the discovery began to settle in. Mr. Holloway's face drained of color, the usual faint blush of health replaced by a sudden pallor. His lips parted, only to close again as if unsure what to say. He swallowed hard, eyes darting around the room, yet his gaze avoided Miss Marple's steady, discerning eyes. She, in contrast, remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression serene yet resolute. She understood all too well the power of observation, the subtle art of allowing guilt to betray itself without a single accusatory word. Curious, Miss Marple remarked softly, almost to herself, how the smallest of objects can betray intentions carefully hidden. She let her words hang in the air, allowing the guests to contemplate the implication without further prompting. The cat, seemingly satisfied with its work, settled atop Mr. Holloway's lap, tail curling elegantly, as though guarding its discovery. The other villagers exchanged nervous glances. Mrs. Peters clutched her teacup tightly, her knuckles white, while the vicar's eyes widened beneath his spectacles. Even Dr. Latham, typically composed, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. There was no question that the fragment's appearance had altered the evening entirely, focusing suspicion in a single, undeniable direction. Yet Mr. Holloway, pale and trembling, remained defiantly silent. I do not know how it came to be there," he murmured, his voice weak but carefully measured. "I have not touched it. I assure you, I have done nothing to harm Mr. Pritchard." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. She noted the tension in his fingers, the slight tremor of his legs, and the faint quiver in his voice. Every detail, every micro-expression, was a clue in its own right. The truth, she knew, had a way of revealing itself in the smallest betrayals, often without the perpetrator even realizing it. The cat, tail flicking with quiet triumph, blinked slowly up at Miss Marple, as if confirming her suspicions. She rose gracefully from her chair, bending slightly to retrieve the fragment, and held it delicately between her fingers. The room remained taut with anticipation. Mr. Holloway's denial hung in the air, fragile yet unyielding, as the first threads of confession began to stir, though the man clung stubbornly to his facade. In that charged silence, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together. The clever, subtle trap had worked, revealing not only the hidden fragment of the letter, but the nervous pulse of guilt that even the calmest demeanor could not fully conceal. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying the faint whispers of the village with it, as if nature itself had paused to witness the unraveling of a carefully woven deception. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Revelation. The vicarage drawing-room was unusually still that evening, the fire casting long, golden shadows across the polished floorboards. Every villager who had been present at the fete was gathered once more, summoned under the pretext of sharing tea and discussing the aftermath of Mr. Pritchard's death. Yet there was a charged tension in the air, a subtle expectation that something momentous was about to be revealed. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, knitting abandoned at her side, eyes bright and sharp with the certainty of one who has observed every thread of a tangled tapestry. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft yet commanding, carrying easily through the room. "I know this is an evening fraught with unease, but I have pieced together the events surrounding Mr. Pritchard's tragic fall. It will take patience, for the sequence of actions is as delicate as the objects involved." The villagers leaned forward, chairs creaking, hands gripping teacups a little too tightly. Mrs. Peters whispered to Mrs. Price, eyebrows raised, while Mr. Holloway shifted uncomfortably, pale and taut with anxiety. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting every reaction, every micro-expression. She allowed the silence to settle, giving her audience time to brace for what was to come. "The key to understanding," she continued, "lies in the seemingly ordinary events of the fate, particularly the raffle. Mr. Pritchard, as always, was generous with his prizes, handling them with care and pride. Among the ornaments and ribbons, however, there was one that carried a far more sinister purpose. A tiny vial, cleverly concealed within a shiny ornament, contained a substance potent enough to cause sudden collapse. Its design was subtle, intended to avoid detection, and placed with knowledge of Mr. Pritchard's habits." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "Now, it is important to note that accidents, or what appear as accidents, can often be disguised as chance. The vial, intended for another recipient perhaps, found its way into Mr. Pritchard's hands. Whether by deliberate action or a moment of misjudgment, the effect was immediate. The letter, subsequently burned, sought to hide a truth that some hoped would never emerge." Eyes widened around the room. Mrs. Ellery clasped her hands to her chest, the memory of her own anxious moments at the fate now tinged with fear and curiosity. Even the vicar straightened, realizing that the threads of secrecy were far more intricate than he had imagined. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost conversational, yet each word carried the weight of careful observation. "The missing fragment found in Mr. Holloway's coat, the cat's attention to the trinkets, and the subtle clues overlooked by the village. All these pieces converge to reveal not just the method, but also the motive. The poison was delivered in a way most would never suspect, hidden within an ornament, passed along in a routine celebration of generosity. The intent was clever, quiet, and effective." Miss Marple's gaze rested on Mr. Holloway, who continued to deny, though his pallor betrayed the truth she had already discerned. "The murderer relies on the ordinary, the familiar, and the unsuspected, and yet, in their cleverness, they leave traces, however faint, that a careful observer can follow." She moved toward the table, gathering the broken shard and the ornament itself, allowing each piece to be seen by the group. "It is these tiny fragments of evidence, overlooked and dismissed, that tell the story fully. The accident, the fear, the secrecy all point to the same conclusion. And now, having observed each gesture, each hesitation, the truth is plain for those with eyes to see." The villagers exchanged anxious glances, the tension almost unbearable. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she concluded, "It is not merely the act, but the understanding of human nature, the anticipation of behavior, that allows such mysteries to be unraveled. And the proof, as always, lies in the small, quiet details." The room was tense with anticipation, the firelight flickering across anxious faces. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, her hands folded calmly, the ginger cat perched silently on the windowsill, as though it, too, understood the gravity of the moment. The villagers leaned forward in their chairs, eyes wide, every whisper and shuffle caught in the charged silence. Miss Marple's gaze swept over them, gentle but unyielding, before settling on Mr. Holloway. "Now," she began, her voice soft yet precise. "We have traced the sequence of events that led to Mr. Pritchard's collapse. The poison, concealed within a raffle ornament, passed into his hands at the fete. Yet the question remains, who could have devised such a subtle and deliberate plan?" Mr. Holloway's lips parted, then pressed together tightly, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He cleared his throat, attempting a measured composure, but the paleness in his face betrayed a mounting panic. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. She had observed him long enough to know that fear is a poor mask for guilt. "It is not Mrs. Ellery who bears blame," she continued, her tone measured and kind, "though the village's whispers have cast suspicion upon her. Rather, we must look closer to the shadows of Mr. Pritchard's own household, to those with motives that were hidden, yet very near." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing the room to fill with suspense. "The culprit," she said finally, turning her gaze directly on Mr. Holloway, "is you. Your motive lay not in personal animosity, nor in greed for your uncle's modest estate, but in a far more practical, desperate concern. The lighthouse, with its hidden ledger of shipments and smuggling activities, contains secrets that, if exposed, would have ruined you. You acted to ensure that these past transgressions remained concealed, and in doing so, you introduced poison, a small vial cleverly hidden, into the celebratory proceedings." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Peters clutched her teacup so tightly that the porcelain rattled, and even the vicar rose slightly from his seat, hand pressed to his heart. Mr. Holloway's eyes widened, disbelief and panic mingling in a sudden, involuntary flush. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, voice trembling. Miss Marple inclined her head, calmly continuing, "The tiny vial, the shattered letter, the careful concealment. It was all within your power to orchestrate. You relied on the ordinary rituals of the village, the trust inherent in giving and receiving, to hide the act. Yet the evidence is in the small, precise details. The cat's behavior, the fragment found in your pocket, the reactions of those around you. Each piece pointed here to you." The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire, the distant ticking of the mantel clock, and Mr. Holloway's uneven breathing. Miss Marple's expression remained composed, almost gentle, as she waited for the inevitable. Slowly, the constable stepped forward from his discreet position in the corner, his hand resting lightly on the man's arm. The ginger cat leapt down from the windowsill, circling once near Mr. Holloway before settling calmly on the hearth, its work complete. Mr. Holloway's denial faltered as the constable guided him toward the door. His shoulders slumped, and his once defiant expression gave way to the stark realization that his scheme had been unraveled. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the door closed behind the constable and the nephew. The villagers exchanged glances, some relief, some lingering shock evident in their eyes. Mrs. Ellery, seated near the fire, allowed herself a quiet exhale, the weight of suspicion lifted. Even the vicar, usually so composed, straightened and shook his head in wonder at the delicate yet thorough revelation. Miss Marple returned to her chair, fingers lightly touching the knitting abandoned at her side. She looked around at the familiar faces, noting the mixture of relief, awe, and lingering curiosity. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the village, for now, could breathe freely once more. Outside, the wind carried a soft, whispering hush over St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself acknowledged the truth now laid bare. Chapter 8. Snow over St. Mary Mead. A gentle hush had settled over St. Mary Mead, the kind that comes only after a storm has passed. Snow blanketed the rooftops and winding lanes, muffling footsteps and softening the edges of the village into a serene winter postcard. Chimneys sent up thin trails of smoke, curling lazily into the pale afternoon sky, while warm light glimmered through curtained windows. Within the vicarage, the familiar rhythm of life resumed, and tea and seed cake flowed once more, accompanied by quiet conversation and cautious laughter. Miss Marple sat at her usual place, the ginger cat curled at her feet, its amber eyes half-closed in contentment. Around her, villagers lingered in comfortable chairs, their conversations more subdued than before, but suffused with a gentle relief. Mrs. Peters, wiping crumbs from her lap, murmured softly about the lessons learned from a season of secrets and deception. "It is remarkable," she said, "how quickly suspicion can arise, and how easily it can fall upon the innocent." Miss Marple nodded, stirring her tea gently. "Indeed, my dear, gossip spreads as naturally as a hearth fire, and yet it is often blind to the truth. We must remember that people act for reasons not always apparent, and that fear, greed, and pride can twist even the most ordinary gesture into something frightening." Her eyes swept the room, resting briefly on Mrs. Ellery, who smiled faintly, hands folded neatly in her lap. "It is an understanding human nature," Miss Marple continued, "that we begin to comprehend the consequences of hidden motives and silent anxieties." Outside, the snow continued to fall, dusting the garden in sparkling white, and the village seemed to pause in reflective quiet. Conversations moved from the recent tragedy to lighter topics: the upcoming church fete, plans for repairs to the vicarage roof, and the joys of winter baking. Children, freed from the shadow of the mystery, ran through the snow-laden streets, their laughter mingling with the soft chime of the church bells. The world felt ordinary again, yet beneath the calm lay a subtle awareness that vigilance and kindness are often companions in the small corners of village life. Miss Marple sipped her tea and considered the lessons hidden in the recent events. The misplaced fears, the secret ambitions, the clever deception, all had converged in a single, delicate incident. Yet in the aftermath, she saw the resilience of the community, the capacity for reflection, and the gentle restoration of trust. People were capable of error, certainly, but they were also capable of understanding, forgiveness, and cautious hope. "The village thrives on its routines," Miss Marple remarked softly to no one in particular. "The simple pleasures of tea, conversation, and good company. And yet, it is the attention to the small details, the kindness extended to others, and the willingness to observe quietly that preserves its harmony. Even in the midst of wrongdoing, the ordinary acts of care and civility endure." Mrs. Peters nodded in agreement, offering a slice of seed cake to the nearest child, who accepted it with bright-eyed delight. The warmth of the room, the soft crackle of the fire, and the gentle hum of conversation formed a protective cocoon around the villagers. Even Mr. Holloway's absence, his misdeeds now dealt with by the constable, was a quiet reminder that the truth, however delayed, would always surface. Miss Marple leaned back, glancing once more at the ginger cat, who blinked slowly in acknowledgment of the peace restored. She allowed herself a quiet smile. The village had endured suspicion and unease, but the simple pleasures of life, tea, seed cake, and shared reflections, had returned, carrying with them the comforting sense that St. Mary Mead would continue, as it always had, in its gentle, resilient way. The vicarage drawing-room glowed warmly in the firelight, shadows flickering across the walls as if performing a quiet, private dance for those who lingered in its comfort. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, the ginger cat curled contentedly on her lap, purring softly with a rhythm that matched the slow crackle of the logs. The room smelled faintly of burnt wood and tea, mingling with the delicate aroma of lemon seed cake cooling on the sideboard. Outside, the world was a soft white, snow blanketing rooftops and garden paths, muffling the clatter and chatter of village life. Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on the cat's fur, stroking in small, deliberate motions as her thoughts wandered over the events of the past weeks. It was remarkable, she reflected, how evil often hid in the most ordinary of places, a commonplace ornament, a seemingly trivial note, or a minor lapse in judgment that no one would think to question. People, in their daily routines and gentle habits, created the perfect canvas for those who wished to conceal misdeeds. And yet, in that very ordinariness lay the key to discovery, for subtle patterns, carefully observed, revealed more than dramatic actions ever could. She considered Mr. Pritchard's sudden collapse, the burned fragments of the letter, the ginger cat's curious interventions, and the final revelation of the nephew's desperate actions. Each element, she realized, had been meticulously ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in consequence. It is often the quiet things, she mused aloud, that tell the most compelling stories. Not the shouting or the overt gestures, but the small movements, the overlooked trinkets, the habitual routines. These are what reveal character and intent. The cat purred, a soft, vibrating accompaniment to her thoughts, as if affirming the truth in her musings. Miss Marple smiled faintly, feeling the gentle warmth of companionship and the quiet satisfaction of mysteries unraveled. She glanced at the hearth, where the logs glowed with a steady orange light, and thought of the villagers she had observed. How fear, gossip, and ambition can twist lives, yet how community, vigilance, and compassion can restore balance. Outside, the snow continued to fall, catching the faint light of the village lamps, turning streets and gardens into a shimmering tableau. In her mind, Miss Marple imagined the lives beyond the vicarage walls, the conversations over warm kitchens, the hurried errands through quiet lanes, the small acts of kindness and mischief that together wove the fabric of village life. Even in the shadow of wrongdoing, she reflected, the ordinary world persisted, resilient and enduring, with its rhythms and its small, comforting pleasures. The cat stretched, arching its back before curling itself more snugly on her lap, and Miss Marple allowed herself a contented sigh. She thought of the constable leading the nephew away, the relieved faces of Mrs. Ellery and Mrs. Peters, the quiet satisfaction of truth laid bare, and the gentle return of order. Yet she knew, wisely, instinctively, that mysteries never fully vanished. One story concludes, only for another to begin, hidden in shadows or whispered in the wind, waiting for the observant and patient to notice its signs. Just then, the church bells rang, their clear notes cutting softly through the muffled hush of falling snow. The sound carried through St. Mary Mead, echoing across rooftops and down narrow lanes, a gentle reminder that life continued beyond the vicarage hearth. Miss Marple looked down at the purring cat, stroked its fur once more, and allowed a small, knowing smile to grace her face. Indeed, as one story closed, another always waited, just beyond the door, in the quiet corners of ordinary life, ready for those who observed closely enough to see it. And so, dear friends, the mystery of the cat who knew murder has been carefully unraveled, and St. Mary Mead returns to its gentle rhythms once more. Beneath the village's quiet hedgerows, snow-laden rooftops, and the hum of everyday life, human passions and hidden ambitions stir as quietly but as fiercely as a winter storm. Miss Marple, ever observant and patient, reminds us that no detail is too small. Sometimes, the truth hides in the most ordinary of places, and occasionally, even a curious cat knows more than we might imagine. Thank you for joining me by the fireside tonight, sharing in tea, seed cake, and the twists of village life. I wonder, if you had been present at the fete, watching the subtle gestures and overheard whispers, what would you have noticed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next tale, keep the kettle warm, your eyes sharp, and remember, the smallest details often reveal the greatest secrets.